Whenever you're lighting up a scene inside Unreal Engine for a very cinematic looking shot, it is necessary to set the accurate contrast ratio for your scene. But what actually is the contrast ratio and how we can adjust that for our scene? That is going to be the topic of today's video. Okay, so let's begin. So what actually is the contrast ratio? The contrast ratio is actually the difference in brightness between the shadowy area of the scene and the illuminated area of the scene. Okay, for example, in here you can see that this is the shadowy area and this is the illuminated area. And you can also notice the difference in brightness between these two areas. This one is pretty bright at the moment, and comparatively this area is not as much bright. Okay, now to demonstrate this, I'm going to select all of these lights and the post-process volume and move this to the folder of the HDRI overcast. I'm going to rename this folder as night scene. Okay, and I'm going to select a directional light, and if I bring down the intensity to, let's say, 10, you can now see that there is not much of a difference in brightness between the shadowy side and the illuminated side. But if I increase the intensity to, let's say, 40, now you can very easily see that this one is much brighter than this one. So this is what we call as a very high contrast. Okay, if I bring this number down to, let's say, 10, you can now see that there is not much of a difference in brightness between the shadowy side and the illuminated side. And this is what we call as the case of a low contrast. If I increase this to 40, you can now see that this area is comparatively much brighter than this one. And this is what we call as a very high contrast. Okay, so this is how we can control the contrast ratio of our scene. We can simply just increase or decrease the intensity of the directional light and have whatever the contrast we want in our shot. Okay, now the question in here is that should we have a very high contrast ratio or a very low contrast ratio for our scene or any other scene in general? Actually, the contrast ratio is a very highly arbitrary setting, and there is no fixed setting that could be used in any type of scene or in any type of shot. And that is because there are several factors that play their role to set up the contrast ratio. It depends on the mood, it depends on the tone, it depends on the message that you want to portray with your shot. So there are several factors that contribute to determine the contrast ratio. Okay, but if you'll allow me to give you a very general and a rough idea, then I would say that in a situation where you have a very neutral, calm, or a very safe sort of environment for your shot, then you can probably get away with a low contrast ratio. For example, maybe something like this perhaps, or maybe let's set this to 10, maybe something like this. Okay, but in some situations such as this one where you have a very intense, dramatic, or intense sort of feel in your shot, then you're going to need a high contrast ratio. Let me split this window, and I'm going to enlarge this window. And you can see that this shot looks very dramatic, very intense, and it is not a very safe or a calm or a neutral sort of shot at all. So in situations such as this, we're going to need a very high contrast. Let me split this window. And for our shot, I think the contrast ratio looks pretty okay, but I would like to increase this to maybe just about 45 or 50 maybe, or maybe somewhere around 45 is a good number. Okay. So let's also adjust the contrast ratio for the day scene as well. I'm going to hide the night scene. I'm going to unhide the environment lights for the day scene. And I'm going to go into camera and also increase the exposure. I'm going to set this back to 1. And for the most part, it looks good as well, but maybe just a little bit more. Maybe increase this to, let's say, 15. That's probably a little bit too much, maybe 13 or 12, maybe 13. Yeah, I think this looks good. Just make sure that you don't overkill this because we also need these details in the shadows as well, especially for the night scene. If I unhide the night scene and hide the daylights and also set the exposure back to -2 and select the directional light. Let me enlarge this window, and if I increase this number a little bit too much, you can now see that we're gonna lose all the detail that we have in those shadows. Okay, so just make sure that you don't overkill this. Going a little bit too crazy on the intensity can easily destroy all those details. Okay, Now, one more thing that I like to mention in here is that if you find yourself in a situation where you have to increase the intensity a little bit too much to have an accurate contrast ratio in your scene, then your shot is going to look too overexposed. So in those situations, what you can do is you can simply just set the intensity to whatever you want and then ease off the exposure in the camera settings or in the post-process volume. Okay. For example, if for some reason, not for this particular shot, but if for some reason I have to increase the intensity to get the accurate contrast ratio, then in this situation, you can see our scene now looks a little bit too overexposed. So what we can do in here is to simply just select the camera and scroll down and simply bring down the exposure, maybe -4 or -3 or maybe somewhere around here, maybe -3. But as you can see in our situation, we cannot use this contrast ratio because now our shadows are just too dark and we don't have as much detail in the shadows like we had beforehand. Okay. So we're going to have to adjust the directional light to maybe somewhere around 45. And then let me select the camera and increase the exposure to maybe -2. Okay. Yeah. So hopefully now you have a little bit of better idea of what actually the contrast ratio is and how you can set that up for your scene or for your shot. So that's pretty much it for today's lesson. And in the next lesson, we're going to discuss part tracing. So I'll see you guys in the next one.